Maryland. Thank you, Belinda. I forgot to tell everybody that we're going to be recording the first part of this webinar this evening. And so if you're okay with that, you have to click on that on your screen. We're not going to be recording the breakout groups that come in the second hour. So after Nick, Karen is going to speak from Baltimore, Maryland. She's a senior program officer with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, where she manages the Food Policy Networks project. And then our third speaker is Mo Garahan, based in Ottawa on unceded Algonquin territory like I am. Mo Garahan is executive director of Just Food. She's also a board member with Sustain Ontario and founding project director of the Food Communities Network, which works coast to coast to coast in this country on food systems issues. So I've asked each of these three presenters to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, answering some general questions like what are some of the things about your national context that are important for us all to know? What does food systems governance mean to groups in your country? And what kinds of challenges or opportunities are emerging for civil society engagement in food systems governance? After our three speakers, we're going to hear some reports, a report on research in Australia on this topic from Belinda Reeve, and some comparisons from Charles and Jill from Canada and the US, and then we'll open up for Q&As. And then towards this end of this hour, we'll take a break. So we'll have a bio break, and then we'll come down back into breakout rooms, which will be more interactive. So all of you who are here today can learn more about one another and reflect on what you've been hearing in the first part. So without further ado, I pass it over to you, Nick Rose.
Thanks very much, Peter, and good morning if you're in Australia, good evening if you're in North America. It's wonderful to be with you this morning to be part of this webinar. As Peter said, my name is Nick Rose. I'm the Executive Director of a National Sustainable Food Systems Organisation here in Naarm, Melbourne, Sustain the Australian Food Network. Acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'm going to start off with three things about the national context in Australia, particularly for those who are not Australians. First and most importantly, Australia, like the United States and Canada, is a settler colonial country, which means that all agriculture and all economic activity takes place on unceded and stolen First Nations land. Australia has no treaty with any First Nations at either a federal or state level, and the initiation and conclusion of respectful treaty processes is an urgent national task, which is essential to any project of food system transformation, food sovereignty, food justice, or food security. There have been some preliminary steps towards a treaty in Western Australia and Victoria, and the newly elected governments at the federal level has committed to the full implementation of the 2017 Uluru Statement of the Heart, in particular to the establishment of a First Nations voice in the Australian Constitution. These are positive beginnings, but there's a long way to go. Secondly, agriculture and other forms of land use practice in Australia have, until recently, been emblematic of the violence, exploitation and extractivism that underpins colonisation and industrial capitalism. Since colonisation in 1788, 100 species have become extinct and a further 1,900 are threatened with extinction. Land use change and agriculture are primary causes. Of those 100 extinct species, 34 are mammals, which, as reported by Mike Foley in the Sydney Morning Herald in July 2020, is about the same number of mammal extinctions as the rest of the world combined over the past 200 years. The good news on the ecological front is that growing numbers of Australian farmers are embracing various forms of agroecological and regenerative agricultural practices, such that this is now a recognisable and significant feature of the Australian food systems landscape. Thirdly, while we have just elected a new Labor government in Australia in what was clearly a resounding call for substantial change in a progressive political direction, there is very little in the policy platform of Labor that says anything about food or agriculture. There is certainly no commitment to a new national food plan, which the previous Labor government introduced when they were last in office a decade ago, much less a national food systems policy or a national food and nutrition strategy. The Greens, by contrast, provided some strong commitments to substantive action on food systems when we surveyed them for our federal election scorecard. They committed to supporting the development of a national food security strategy, the creation of Green Agriculture Australia as a $250 million R&D centre to support regenerative agriculture, amongst other positions. The Greens also had their best ever federal election result, increasing their membership of the House of Representatives by 400% to 4 members, and are expected to double their numbers in the Senate to 12, which will give them effective control of the upper house. In terms of the state of food system governance in Australia, very briefly, I would say that it is highly fragmented, lacking coherence, and is largely driven by the profit requirements of large agribusiness and agri-food corporations, fast food chains, and supermarkets. Human and ecological health rate a distant second and third to the demands of capital accumulation and economic growth. And this is true of the economy and society in general, as well as the food and agricultural system in particular. In contrast to the US and Canada, Australia has little to no experience with food policy councils and other forms of institutionalized food governance structures that would facilitate civil society inclusion and participation in food governance. Progress is, however, being made at the local government level, as demonstrated by the research that Belinda will present, and to which I can attest from my own direct experience with several local governments in Victoria. And finally, if I may, Peter, I've just got a couple of observations on what food systems governance means, and then finally the current opportunities. There'll be about 2 minutes, if that's all right. So what does food system governance mean? In layperson terms, it means having a say and being directly involved in important decisions and processes that affect key elements of food and farming systems. This would include a wide range of specific issues such as dietary guidelines, health star rating systems, regulatory questions impacting small-scale producers, land use planning decisions regarding the opening of new fast food restaurants, and access to urban land for community gardens, as well as the development and implementation of food system and food security strategies. And so finally, in terms of current opportunities here in food system governance, urban agriculture has been a major focus for us at Sustain since our establishment in 2016. We've run 3 national urban agriculture forums and are now planning for the 2nd National Urban Agriculture Month. In 2020, we conducted a national pandemic gardening survey that received over 9,000 responses. One of the lasting impacts of the pandemic is a realization amongst some policymakers that the integrity of Australia's food system cannot be taken for granted, as it largely had been until the past 2 years. There is a growing realization that much more needs to be done in terms of food system resilience and domestic food security. This creates openings and opportunities for advocacy on a range of fronts, and in particular on urban agriculture, having regard to the policy commitments of the Greens that I mentioned earlier and the significant increase in political power that they now have at the federal level. So I'll finish on that note and hand back to you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Nick. And thank you, Charles, for unmuting me. I was trying to unmute myself. So wonderful to have so many people here joining us, and thanks for those great comments to start off, Nick. I will now pass the baton to Karen Bassarat from Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. And now Charles is looking to unmute you. I'm sure it's coming. There you go.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you for the invitation to join this conversation. I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to give some context around food systems governance in the United States and kind of some contrast between Australia. Unlike Australia, we've had a long history with, or a semi-long history with food policy councils. I work with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, and we run a network to provide technical assistance and support to multi-stakeholder coalitions that are working on food systems transformation through policy at local, state, and regional levels with some federal engagement. So I wanted to start with kind of this historical context that the first Food Policy Council in the US was formed in 1980s, kind of in a period where the US was looking at civic engagement kind of being diffused down to the neighborhood level. And so a group emerged because they recognized that food insecurity was an issue in their community and tried to leverage their local government to provide support in terms of addressing issues of food insecurity. There was a long gap between the evolution of food policy councils, and in 2005 we started to see an increase in rising in numbers, and today there are about 301 councils across the United States. That includes around 3 in tribal nations, although the classification of food policy councils in tribal nations is not directly parallel to what we consider food policy councils in other areas of the United States. Some interesting things in terms of supporting this evolution of food policy councils is that there's We do not have a national food plan in the US. We have the United States Department of Agriculture, which runs a lot of support programs for food systems work, nutrition, health, and agriculture. And as the administrations in our federal government change and ebb and flow, the interest and investment in food systems work ebbs and flows as well. And so with the Obama administration, we saw a significant increase in the number of food policy councils, particularly because of the Let's Move campaign, as well as a campaign called Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food, which was driving consumer interest in food systems, as well as driving interest in childhood obesity and school nutrition programs. And with that came a flurry and flood of investment that supported initiatives at the local level. In the United States as well, there's this tension between who has control over food systems. The federal government provides investment in programs and funding and support, particularly around food and nutrition programs, and particularly supporting farmers and agriculture. But then you get down to the state and local levels, and those supports change. And so there's a question of who provides governance over these systems in the US. And a survey from the Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems in 2015 surveyed local governments across the US. There were about over 2,000 that were surveyed, and around 73% of them showed that they did some support for a local food systems program or project, but then there were another that still felt that the charge of food policy did not belong within the local government. And so when you have these factors of the federal investment, but not necessarily running of programs, you have local government that doesn't think that they control the food systems, then it falls to our civil society organizations and individuals to be advocates. And so what we see within kind of the context of our work in food governance and food policy councils is that there's a range of advocacy and actions and civil society engagement in food systems, and that depends on the local context of your jurisdiction. So the socioeconomic standards, your culture, and then the political influence of communities. Right now, local governments in the US are grappling with kind of the value and credibility of food systems, and a lot of the value and credibility has been driven by consumers and advocates pushing their local governments for change, for investment in food systems. And as that has been pushed from civil society organizations and kind of from the outside, we see transitions in local government. Starting in 2010, we started to see the creation of positions and at this local level, mainly cities and counties that were dedicated to supporting food systems work and food policy. And right now there's around, I think 20 to 22 positions in local government that are specifically dedicated to food systems. So when we talk about food systems governance in the US, kind of our definition is fluid and it's evolving. And it's a trial and error of what works within the community context and with the local government. There's about 25% of food policy councils that are embedded in local government, but the majority sit within a civil society organization still. And kind of as the food system and the movement in the United States has evolved, we see some growing trends, particularly around this relationship and tension between where do these food councils, these collaborative governance structures live? Do they live in government? Do they live outside of government? And how does that align with community engagement and the voices that show up to the table? If they're embedded in government, does that bring farmers to the table or does that drive them away? Does it bring community members, particularly people of color, to the table or does it drive them away? Other tensions that we see within our food movement and that we're reckoning with on a continual basis is this notion of how does racial equity show up in food systems governance and whose voice shows up at the table? And how do we begin to bring more voices of communities of color and people that are not professionals or academics to that table to influence policy decisions? And then lastly, I just point out that kind of there's this tension that's growing across the US and I believe in other countries in terms of this notion of rural-urban divide. There's a lot of investment coming now in the federal government into urban ag, and there's concerns about kind of taking away from the investment in rural communities. But these communities and what we've seen is they rely on one another. And so what does it look like to take a regional approach and start to break down this division? In urban areas, we've seen some of the suburban regions being those locations of producers and processing centers. And so there is no ability for urban areas to exist without the rural support. And so how do these groups and how does that governance work across a regional scale? I think I'm under time, but with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was fascinating. Great opening remarks, and you've raised a lot of issues that I think will resonate with many of the people listening. And I know that the research that Belinda and Charles and Jill will talk about shortly, this is going to come back as well, these themes. I now pass the floor to Mo. Welcome.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks so much, Nick and Karen as well. You're going to see some very similar themes here, although some differences. So the first question we had was to describe 3 things about our national context. The first one, which dovetails to my land acknowledgement, is that we don't have a national context. We are coast to coast to coast of many nations, including Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit nations, Quebec as a nation. It's critical, and you'll hear me say Indigenous Territories Canada, to identify the co-governance. So our recognition of co-governance on the lands across Indigenous and settler communities and governments and leadership. It's a way of trying to use language to do an ongoing, more deep acknowledgement around dual governance. Another context is, that we are a lands of food lands and waters, fisheries, forest foods, hunting, gathering, agricultural activity. The diversity of people and foods is enormous. Within that, we have a serious failure to incorporate civic society into accountable food systems governance. Just 2 quick recent and ongoing examples. Some of you may have heard of the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network. In Canada, companies are just last week newly able to assess the safety of some of their own genetically engineered foods without any government oversight. And this is after decades of civil society, residents, eaters, households, organizations, coast to coast to coast across Indigenous Territories Canada, speaking about the need for transparency and labeling so that people can make a choice in terms of if they choose to eat foods with genetically modified product or not. And that's continued to be unaccountable to civic society. Another example is that I'm assuming most people on the call here know that Canada is unfortunately the only G7 country without a national coast to coast to coast school food program, recognizing multi-jurisdictional levels between Indigenous and provincial authorities. And the hard battle to bring investment to something as central to health and equity as school food programs. So the last thing I would say in terms of our national context is the civic society engagement opportunities. We have neighborhood community development opportunities in many communities, whether rural, remote, urban, suburban. We do have a lot of local regional food policy groups, we'll say, whether that's alliances or networks or councils, incorporating things like food lens into official plans or into climate change plans or agriculture equity plans. We have provincial territorial networks, and then we have ongoing civil society facilitation of networks through Food Secure Canada, which has worked on policy collaboration on some of the very tough issues across, people have to help me, but it's over 20 years. And then we have Canada Food Policy Advisory Council, which while there is that recognition of the need for greater collaboration for meaningful progress on these complex issues, we haven't seen a lot of outcome from this structure yet. And there is absolutely no accountability across neighborhood, provincial, territorial, coast to coast to coast food governance tables, even as there's a real attempt at these tables to incorporate diverse perspectives geographically, sectorally, ethnoculturally. We're not seeing the outcomes of that transparency and cohesion and accountability across these, and it's critical. So some of the things that I just would like to highlight in terms of challenges that groups are experiencing as identified through Food Communities Network, which is a group that is connecting local civil society as well as elected official governance structures. We see the continued reality that food system is continually relegated to emergency food. And this was reconditioned during the global pandemic, as evident by the investments that were made, which were largely into charitable solutions, as opposed to recognizing the long emergency and the resilience that's needed to be invested in, along with food systems facilitation. At the same time, these opportunities laid bare the ground. We've heard that a lot. Laid bare the gaps in our food literacy as the first time that middle class Indigenous Territories Canada was en masse food insecure, and with continued awareness about a precarious global food supply. It feels like there is more of an opening right now for greater food systems literacy, and that there's a desire among maybe folks that have not been coming to the table in the past to learn more about what is needed to actually build resilience in our communities. In Canada, we have the aging farming population at 55 plus. Our farming population is under 2%. We import over 90% of our seed annually. Land ownership is increasingly untenable for most of us to access at rural or urban levels. And there's a real increasing polarization of income and access to both food, income, well, all of food, income, housing, and land. Small and medium farms are mislabeled as hobby farmers as opposed to identifying the critical role they play in our commercial activity. So literacy is very much needed across our food systems in order to move deeply held charitable models towards equitable food sharing and land sharing and decision making sharing, intersectional and cross-sectoral models. I'm looking to Peter to give me the heads up as to where we are in time. As mentioned by my colleagues, we're within a context of truth and reconciliation goals, which are slow moving and need to be emphasized. We're in a movement of Black food sovereignty leadership, with the Toronto releasing the first Black food plan for Black community, for and by Black community. We're at a place, I feel, one of the tensions, I think, is the need for all of us who want to take any kind of a leadership role in our families, in our communities, in our governance tables, whether settler, whether white, whether global majority. How are all of us going to be prioritizing decolonizing and deeply equitable practices across our food systems? I want to also emphasize one of the tensions we see is building anew and building upon. So building upon the lessons that have been learned is critical as building anew and breaking apart things that haven't been working. And I find that oftentimes one set denigrates the other in the name of justice, and we need both. We need building upon and building anew. So the last things I'll say is where our food systems governance opportunity is right now is in things like the building of networks and collaboration with a key central tenet of transformative food systems. So meeting around collective kitchen tables, meeting on community farms, meeting cooperative food businesses, community grocery stores, seeing things like Farmers for Climate Change, which is advented here in Canada, Indigenous Territories Canada, pardon me, and investing in food system facilitation of food governance so that it is community-led with partnership and accountability to and from elected governance tables. But there has to be an understanding in all of our funders, whether government or philanthropic, that the investment has to be in community-led food system facilitation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mo. You packed so much in, but really, the three of you really set a fantastic base for our discussions this evening. I know you each spoke a lot about a lot of different things happening in your countries, but it gave some excellent context. I would just like to remind people, I see many of you have added sticky notes about who you are and where you're from in the mural board, but I think many on this call today haven't done that yet, and we'd love to know who you are and where you're coming from. And I also see that there's a place to put resources and links and so on. This first 55 minutes or so is really a presentation at you, I recognize, but the second part will be in breakout rooms and there'll be more interaction among everybody here. I'm going to turn the floor now to Belinda Reeve, who is senior lecturer at the University of Sydney Law School, to speak for about 7 minutes about some research that she and some of her partners have undertaken in the Australian context on the role of civil society in food system governance. And then we'll go straight from that to some comments and feedback from Charles Levko, Canada Research Chair in Equitable and Sustainable Food Systems at Lakehead University, and then Jill Clark from Ohio State University, John Glenn College of Public Affairs, to give some comparative comments to Belinda's presentation. So over to you, Belinda.
Thanks very much, Peter. So I'm just going to share some slides with you as part of my presentation today. So as Peter mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about the, oh, pardon me, I have the wrong slides there. Just if I could have 1 second. Is that? No, still wrong. Sorry about this, everyone. I'll be right with you. Okay, I should have the right ones this time. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. So as Peter mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about the role of Australian civil society organisations in food system governance. And I'm going to be presenting some research that formed part of a larger Australian Research Council funded project on strengthening food systems governance at the local level. So I'm going to be presenting some survey results today. And this survey was undertaken by an honours student attached to the project, Rebecca Smits. And the research was then refined and built on by Amy Carrard, who's a research assistant on the project. Just to give you an overview of what the project in its entirety looked like, it really had two components. So we were interested in the role of local governments and civil society organisations in creating a healthy, sustainable and equitable food system. For the local government phase of the project, we mapped all local government policies in New South Wales and Victoria, two key Australian states that were concerned with creating healthy, sustainable and equitable food systems. We also undertook a survey of local governments in those two states. And then finally, we did case studies of 6 local governments who we identified as having innovative policies or practices in this area. For the second phase of the project, we focused on Australian civil society organisations. And again, we undertook a survey of those organisations, and we combined that with case studies of 6 organisations as well. So today I'm going to be talking about our survey results. I don't really have time in this presentation to go through the methodology, but I'm very happy to answer questions about that at the end. I will mention that our survey instrument was based on a similar survey undertaken by Peter and Charles and their team in Canada, which we then modified for the Australian context. So this slide presents a basic overview of the types of organisations that responded to our survey. So really one of the objectives of the survey was just to get a sense of what organisations are working in food system governance. So we had 43 organisations respond to the survey. Of these, 65% were NGOs or registered charities, followed by 6 social enterprises, 4 food-specific coalitions, 4 businesses, and 1 collaborative research project. Only one of the responding organisations was Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander owned or led, but that we can't really draw any conclusions from that about the importance of these organisations to food system governance or how widespread they are. Around 2/3 of the organisations, so 15 of the respondents, had been involved in food system governance activities for over 10 years, but there were a couple of new kids on the block. So a few that had been active for less than 1 year, or we also see 1 to 3 years there as well. So in the next slide, this gives you a sense of the sectors of work that these organisations were involved in. So this figure charts the mean rank of respondents' answers to the sectors of work in which they're involved. So they could select as many sectors as was relevant and then place them in order. So from our data, we found that education, food security, policy advocacy, sustainability in the environment, and research were the highest ranking. This slide gives you a sense of the organisations that, the activities that organisations were involved in. And we've got a column there that lists some examples of those different types of activities. So they reported a really broad range of activities, and we saw practical on the ground activities that aim to address issues like food insecurity or diet related health. And we also saw organisations involved in activities like advocacy and lobbying and research as well. So we asked respondents to tell us about what they thought the benefits were of their involvement in food system governance. And I don't have time to go through all of them here, but some of the ones that they listed were bringing integrity to the food system, enabling governance at the local level, which we've just heard some speakers talk about just now, promoting collaboration and a collective voice or actions, and drawing on and learning from diverse lived experiences. And in particular, organisations talked about the role that they played in giving voice to people with lived experience of food insecurity, for example, and drawing on that lived experience to develop locally relevant, contextually relevant initiatives. They also saw their activities as addressing issues like food security, food access, and health outcomes. Their activities help to build capacity, including in the sector itself. And they're also allowed for awareness raising and information dissemination amongst the community. We asked survey respondents about the factors that enabled their participation in food system governance. And they told us that a key factor was funding. Internal organisational capacity and attitudes was also very important. Participation processes, and by that I mean government law and policy review processes and inquiries that were inclusive and accessible, and in some instances where non-government organisations were asked to participate, so they were invited to participate as well. Collaboration between organisations, external support, community support, and having relevant knowledge and awareness and data on which to base initiatives as well. We asked respondents about the barriers to their participation in food system governance, and many of the barriers that came up were the converse of the enablers when they were absent. So lack of funding was a key barrier, and particularly there was often organisations said that funding was tied to the delivery of a particular project, and it was hard to secure funding that just supported everyday organisational activities that enabled the organisation to continue. Limited internal capacity was an issue, particularly as organisations often relied on volunteers. Exclusionary participation processes, so the converse of what I just mentioned. A lack of cohesion and coordination between stakeholders in the non-government sector, issues of power and influence, and particularly with the food industry having outsized influence over food system governance processes, a lack of community support or awareness for food system issues and government support, framing and perspectives. And what I mean by that is a lack of common language that is understood by people on the ground. So perhaps words like food systems or governance lack meaning to members of the community. A lack of data on the extent of issues like food insecurity, and the need for more evidence of effectiveness was also identified as a barrier. So I want to conclude with some key learnings from our research. The first is that we found that there are a wide range of civil society organisations working in food system governance. We obviously couldn't identify all of them, but they range from very small local food system initiatives through to national health organisations. Organisations had very diverse goals and activities, many of which aimed at creating practical change in the community. And as I mentioned, addressing urgent issues like food insecurity and diet-related health. They also engaged in a wide range of what we could characterise as governance activities, things like lobbying and advocacy. But for the most part, we found that their activities could be characterised as multi-stakeholderism, using a term that was developed by Peter and his colleagues in a 2019 book. So we found that in most instances, non-government organisations were operating from the outside in. We found very few examples of truly collaborative initiatives with civil society organisations where they were acting as equal partners. Although there were a couple of examples of NGOs working very collaboratively with local governments on food system policy making, for example. But we didn't really find anything like food policy councils like you do in North America. We also identify some mechanisms to increase civil society participation in food system governance, and many of these will probably come as no surprise to people working in this space. So these include increased funding and funding that isn't tied to the particular delivery, of a particular project, inclusive, accessible law and policy reform processes, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led groups. And we'd also like to see new collaborative forms of food system governance, like food policy councils operating in Australia. So that brings me to the end of my presentation today, but you're very welcome to take a look at our website, where there's a range of resources that have come out of this research project. And you're also very welcome to get in contact with me via email or Twitter. Thanks very much, and I'll stop sharing there.
Thanks so much, Belinda. And I'm going to pass it straight over to Charles to give some reaction from Indigenous territories and Canada, following Mo's lead.
Great, thanks, thanks Peter, and thanks everyone else. So I only have about 3 minutes, so I'm going to speak a bit fast and try to get through a few things here. So first off, what I wanted to focus a bit on is some research that our team did here in Canada, really focusing on the work that we've done with a range of academics, community practitioners, that have been working to better understand the experiences of civil society organizations and food movements across food systems governance landscapes, and really to critically analyze the successes, the challenges, and the future opportunities for establishing a kind of collaborative governance processes with the goal of building healthier, more equitable, and more sustainable food systems. So we wanted to get a better sense of who is involved in this work in Canada. So in late 2019, we launched a national survey, very similar, as Belinda mentioned, to the one in Australia. We did it in French and English. To just try to get a lay of the land. We also followed that up with about 70 interviews from representatives from social movements and civil society organizations, along with a number of Indigenous elders and leaders involved in this kind of participatory foods governance spaces. And the results of some of our research offer a really interesting snapshot of these kind of civil society perspectives on food systems governance, much of which speak to what Mo has already spoken about in the first part of this workshop in the Canadian context, and also many of the similar results that Belinda talked about in the Australian context. So we found that there was quite a lot of engagement of food systems governance in various levels, with different kind of understandings of what that even means. The majority of the respondents we spoke to, similar to in Australia, come from civil society organizations and social movements, and focus their efforts kind of at the municipal regional scale and also at the provincial and territorial scale. But different from Australia, most of the common areas that folks that we heard from focus on were in food policy councils. So similar to what Karen spoke about, there is quite a vibrant network of food policy councils here in Canada, or food policy groups, food strategies, and a range of other kind of food policy initiatives. Also, a number of folks were focusing on agriculture, and a lot of folks that were also focusing on Indigenous food sovereignty issues or Indigenous settler partnerships. So reflecting on these survey results in the kind of scholarly literature and also discussing some of this with our community partners and our team, we have identified kind of 4 main gaps in food systems governance that we think really require some additional focus and study, and we're really hoping to address this in the coming years. So I'm going to very briefly, probably in about a minute and a half, try to just kind of name these quickly. First off, while there are many claims to address food system transformation through a kind of variety of initiatives in the country, most of these focus on particular issues in particular places. And while there's been a lot of key moments throughout history when civil society actors have come together to try to scale up and scale out their work, much of the work has, a lot of this memory has been lost. And this is, Mo kind of spoke to this a little bit in her words as well. So a lot of the organizations that we were speaking to and the people were new organizations, been founded in the last kind of 5 to 10 years. There'd been a lot of staff turnover, and many folks didn't even know about some of these things that have been happening over the last 30 years. So moving forward, our research really seeks to kind of develop more comprehensive understanding of the historical engagement in food movement activities and governance issues to help inform and strengthen kind of emerging models and participatory food systems governance. I really like the way Mo put it, the kind of balancing the new activities and the emerging activities with some of that historical memory as well, and finding a kind of balance there. Second, we found that a greater focus needs to be placed on meaningful Indigenous settler relationships, as Nick and Mo both talked about, and Karen as well, as an important part of collaborative governance work. And this speaks to the treaty context and the ongoing settler colonial reality in Canada. And our future research is really going to aim to explore what these civil society organizations and social movements are doing to address barriers and challenges of settler organizations struggling kind of with and or currently involved in engaging with Indigenous settler partnerships. Third, the labor issues. Labor is central to food systems work, but not a lot of focus on that. So we wanted to kind of explore that more. And just finally, to finish off, the onset of the pandemic in early 2020 highlighted a real kind of the impact of vulnerabilization on essential workers, Black, Indigenous, people of color, racialized communities, and people living in poverty. And many of the community-based organizations really responded quickly, but they learned a lot in the process. So a lot of our work now is trying to understand more how that all played out and what we can learn from that. So lots more to say, but my time is up. I will maybe I'll just pass it straight to Jill, so we can, she can speak.
Excellent, thank you, Charles. Thanks, everyone. There's so much to build from here, but I'm just going to give a few comments on Belinda's research that are really based in my experience working with and knowledge of U.S. food policy councils. And so, you know, there's experimentation clearly happening across both countries as we kind of carve out these new roles in this policy arena, and a genuine, like, universal desire for democratic change in the food system. And there are some interesting similarities and differences in this experimentation. So a variety of organizational forms working in governance found in both countries, which is important because we need multiple and varied roles in governance. But what the Australian data shows is a healthier participation, at least for these groups around coming from private for-profit sector engaging in governance. In the US, we have less representation from that sector locally in our councils. Yet we have this greater relationship with government, and maybe that's just something about, you know, kind of existing over time, and maybe that's something that you're all moving towards. There's some similarities in the governance activities across the countries, like connecting and collaborating and networking. But the aim of the governance activities, namely the policy priorities, there's actually quite a difference in the focus in Australia on food production and natural resources in the environment, which is much less in the United States, and a greater focus on issues around hunger and healthy food access, which Karen touched on. But we face similar barriers in our work: lack of funding and capacity, power imbalances, exclusionary participatory processes. And so to that end, I want to end with 2 points, food for thought, if you will. So I believe there's this collective normative notion across all 3 countries that civil society engagement is good and will create public value, meaning it creates value in society. But civil society can create, reinforce, or exacerbate problems. Related, there's normative goals towards collaborative governance for the purpose of power sharing. And one issue to consider is that most collaborative governance processes focus on consensus. Consensus can avoid necessary conflicts that reveal power imbalances, and consensus can obscure desires and needs of marginalized groups. So there is an increasing call to embrace dissent and conflict in governance processes in order to enable more equitable solutions. Now, by virtue of me being here and participating directly in collaborative governance in the US, and by studying what I do, I clearly see promise, but I think it's unwise if we don't stop to reflect on our assumptions about how power works. And the second issue I want to leave you with is the fact, and this is something that Karen raised, this is the survey that Belinda did as it's one point in time, it creates a great baseline. But what we've learned by repeatedly doing these surveys is, our understanding of food governance evolves. We keep learning more and more during this experimentation. And in addition, the way that councils in the United States arrange themselves to engage in governance evolves. So a group could go from a grassroots group to a nonprofit to an arm of local government, right, devolve and then be born again into another form. And if you think about roles in governance, like as a larger policy ecosystem, this makes sense. The policy process and politics are always changing, and responding to and learning in this environment requires flexibility. So making evolution of a group kind of necessary. And so don't think we should be afraid of that evolution. So I look forward to policy and governance learning across these three countries. This is really fantastic. And just thanks for the invitation to respond to the research that was done in Australia.
Okay, thank you, Charles, Jill, and Belinda. And Jill, with those provocative comments, on the one hand, you see, and we have all seen, the power of collaboration, of people with distinct perspectives and capacities and skill sets and points of view working together on local challenges. But I hear what you're saying, that there are power relations in this field, and we can't just ignore them in some of this work. And also really interesting, given what Belinda was saying about, there's not a lot of food policy councils in Australia yet, and yet, don't assume that that's the be all and end all, and the forms of what those are and how they evolve over time is really interesting. So everybody, we have just a couple of minutes to answer if anybody has big questions or questions of clarification from specific speakers, and I invite you to put that into the chat, and we'll take a couple of questions before we go to a break. And then when we come back from the break, we will go into breakout rooms, and there'll be more interaction among all of you who are here this evening. So are there any big questions coming up for questions for clarification of any of the speakers in the chat? Okay, so what I'm going to do is we're going to take our 10-minute break now until 5 past the hour. In the interim, Amy and Belinda will organize those of you who stick around into breakout rooms. So if you're going to go take a bio break and you plan to stick around, just leave your computer on. If you're satisfied with this evening's presentation and you're going to move on to some other part of your day, we really appreciated having you here. Thank you for joining us this evening. And I just want to put one more plug in. Perhaps somebody can put the link in for our subsequent webinar on June 14th and 15th, 14th in North America, morning of the 15th in Australia, on food equity, justice, and Indigenous settler relations. These were all themes that came up this evening in food systems governance in Canada, Australia, and the United States. And we have excellent speakers planned for that webinar in 2 weeks' time. So we're going to take a break until 5 after 8. And sorry, that's my time, 5 after the hour, wherever you are. And then we'll come back into breakout rooms. What we're going to do in those breakout rooms, just to kind of give you a sense, we're going to start with a go around, preferably with cameras on, where people can talk about who they are and their impressions of what they heard from the speakers, and might also be a chance to raise any questions for that discussion. And then we're going to hone in on the question of what do you see as the opportunities for civil society playing a role in food systems governance in your communities and your organizations in the space that you work in, and what are the outcomes that you're aiming to achieve. We're going to do all of that in small breakout rooms, depositing the gems of all of that discussion onto the Miro board. And we'll come back for a wrap up where Belinda's going to wrap up some of what she sees on the Miro boards. And then I've got one more question for you at the end. But first, let's take a 10-minute break. So see you all again at 8:05 in the breakouts.